Morning. Well, today is July 27th, and we'll see if we can't get in another chapter today. Now, today, to start with, we want to talk about our home, the home of George and Alma Grambua, 3rd and Woodward in Rogers City, built in the period about 1911, 1912. Now, our parents purchased 2 lots in what was called the Gums Addition to the village of Rogers for $30 each from P.H. Heff, who at that time owned that land. He had other property in that block, as you recall, because he had previously, because afterwards, then of course the Ewell house was built, the Brown house was built, the Vincent house was built. There was a big duplex built over on 4th Street, and a couple other homes. So PHF built about 9 homes in that block area. The corner lot where the Presbyterian Church was, and next door to that was C.H. Osgood. And on facing the other street, on 4th Street on the corner lot, was Emil Nagel. On the opposite lot was Ted Theodore Nagel. That later became known as the Krotsky House. All right, now get back to that original area. Now, you recall that the lumber, a lot of the lumber, to build the folks' house came out of the big pine tree in Metz, which we had talked about previously. That tree had survived the Metz fire, and then with the help of family and friends and brothers, that tree was taken down and sawed into lengths, 8, 10, 12, 16-inch timbers. I would say that the logs were cut into lengths. The logs were then hauled to a mill in Hawks that did not burn in the Metz fire, and there it was converted into lumber for building a home. Now, after the lumber was made up, then, of course, time they had to find a place to store it. And so the lumber, Mother and Dad decided that now that they had the lots, that they would go ahead and put a barn on that property, which they wanted to do anyway, because most people in town had barns for horses. And so that's what they did. They built the barn first, and then the lumber was brought in by Slade, I suppose, team, and stored in that barn on the 1st and 2nd floor, because there was a great big attic or hayloft in that. And what they couldn't put in there, they stored outside in a neat pile, well covered. And that barn, of course, later became our garage, as you remember. Now, also shortly after that period of time, the folks had to put down a well, because every home needed a water supply. And so a well was contracted for. Now, Dad, primarily on that house, did his own contracting, which was quite common in those days. He hired a Mr. Emil Nagel, who had horses and a scoop, and they scooped out the basement area. And then he hired masons to put up the walls. And the walls were made out of big rock, mostly great big rock, filled with a mortar. And one of the masons was a man by the name of Mr. Julius Semple, that you recall. He had an assistant by the name of Harry Schmidt, and probably a few other fellows. Now, the split rock, which appears above the street level in that house, was made by Julius Semple. After the basement walls were put up, he hired carpenters to frame the house. Now, there could have been, Mother said there was a variety of men that worked on that, but some of the ones that she recalled, one was a Mr. Coonert. He was a carpenter by trade, as she said. And he built that Coonert house, which was later occupied by the McDonalds. He was assisted by a man by the name of Albert Strike, who was a well-known carpenter around town, and another one from one of the Schulk family. Now, the water well, the flowing well, artesian well, was put down by the Pines brothers. They were well drillers. Now, one of those pines was Wilson Pines. Ernestine Treese, remember, one of their classmates, Ivern. That was his dad and his brother. They put down that well. After the house was up, then, of course, they hired painters. One of the painters was Mr. Rudolph Polk. Rudolph Polk was the father of Lyman Polk, my good friend. And another one of the painters was a Mr. Hanson and his son, Henry. Now, Mr. Hanson was the father of Emma Fish, who was married to Fred Fish. Anna Fish. The furnace was put in by a man named Luft, assisted by a man named Tank. The electricity in the house was put in by a man named George Brooks. George Brooks originally and his family lived in the house which you later remember was the Dulac house at the end of Woodward Avenue where it turns. Now the special cabinet work, woodwork of the floor bases and around all the windows and all the doors, that beautiful woodwork out of that beautiful pine, most of that was done by this Mr. Coonert. He was a real cabinet maker by trade. He built those beautiful pantry windows. Okay, now, the size of the lot in which the house was built was 100 by 150. It had a full basement, and of course, that well that was put down was an artesian well. As you remember, it was a powerful well. It was powerful enough so that they could put in a toilet and have it operate by the power of the water itself. And also, that house had a furnace. Now, Mother said that, I asked her about this, and she said I was about the cost of that house. Well, she said she thought probably around $3,000, although she said all of that wasn't necessarily cash. Cash was a little bit lower due to the fact that they had a good quantity of the lumber. And also, it was a little bit higher probably than it could have been because they put in a toilet system. And right from word go. Inside toilet system, flush toilet. Otherwise, it would have been a house in the back. Now, at the time that the house was being planned, C.H. Osgood asked my dad what they're going to do for heat. And Dad said, well, let's put in a kitchen stove and then put in another stove probably somewhere between the living room and the dining room. Osgood said to Dad, he said, the smart thing to do, if you can afford it, would be to put in a furnace now. It'll be a lot less costly if you can put it in and put the leads and everything in from the word go. Dad said he couldn't afford it. Osgood says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll loan you the money, no interest. You pay me back a couple dollars a month until it's paid for. So Mother and Dad accepted it. And a chunk of concrete flooring was put in the basement just big enough to hold the furnace. The rest of the basement down there, as I recall, even as a youngster, was gravel. Even where Mother did the laundry. Now, she didn't always do the laundry down there in that corner, because some of it she did right up in the kitchen for a long period of time. The rest of the cement floor was put in until after, probably 1915 or 16, she thought, when coal became available through Michigan Lime. Coal was brought in to run the power plant at Michigan Lime, and then they had a surplus, which they sold to the people of the community. So at that time, Mother and Dad decided to finish off the basement floor. They put in a coal bin, which was put in by blocks, and then they also put in a vegetable or a fruit cellar at that same time. And after a period of time, in the early days of the furnace, of course, everything was run by wood. And then gradually, as the coal came in, then they turned to coal. Later on, they turned to hard coal, soft coal. Then they turned to a furnace that burnt fine coal, coke, tried a variety of things. Now, in conjunction with the toilet system, of course, you had to have a cesspool or a septic tank. And the cesspool was put in, and then later on, a septic tank was put in to handle the waste from the toilet, as well as the washing, and also from the kitchen. Now, the lot on which the home was built, as you recall, had a lot of apple trees. There were 11 apple trees and 2 cherry trees on that lot, because it originally had been a part of an orchard. Now, we didn't have any plum trees or any pear trees on our particular lot, but as you recall, our neighbors did. Well, that's just the way the ball bounced. The lot originally was not a part of the village of Rogers. It was just outside of it. A man by the name of Gum had bought that chunk of property and planted it, the open spaces, to fruit trees with the idea of selling the fruit by boat downstate to Detroit and other southern markets. Later, that area was sold to P.H. Heft, and then he sold off the lots. Now, later, probably, I don't know just when, maybe right along about right shortly after World War I, our parents put in a water system, a water cistern, water storage, soft water storage system to catch water that came off the roof. It used to be caught in barrels for washing purposes. And so a cistern was built on the outside, underground, an area about 5 or 4.5 by 4.5 by 10, and it was built out of cement block, plastered, and water off the roof was guided into it through eaves troughs, and the water flowed by gravity into the basement. The floor of the cistern was probably 18 inches higher than the floor in the basement, and a pipe was run through, and so mother could turn on the water, get the soft water she wanted for washing, and then just turn it off. The soft water was easy on the soap, and it was generally liked for washing clothes. Now, that cistern, of course, has been filled in years back after the city water system came in, and after water softeners came on the market. I suppose the area is still there. Whether it's empty or full of gravel, I do not know. But I do know where it is. It had an opening going to the outside, about 3 foot square, probably, with a big, heavy, 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch iron cover on it. And now, as far as electricity in the house is concerned, Mother said she thought it came in around 1916, that is, into our home. The plant built a power plant and sold surplus electricity to the Rogers City Power Company, and the Rogers City Power Company is the one that put up the electric lines around town. And as people wanted to, they tapped in. She thought ours came in about 1916, and it's about that time, or shortly thereafter, after it did come in, and that they did finish off the upstairs. She said they got a telephone. She thought about 1916. Now, there were phones in town before that, but what she meant was that's when they hooked up. The sidewalks along 3rd and Woodward, she thought about 1914 or 15. She wasn't sure. Now, the city water did not come in until 1930. City water came down 3rd Street, the bedroom windows of Mother and Dad. And after that came in, of course, the electric pump that was on the well, artesian well, was discontinued. Now the water in that well, I imagine is still there. If you tapped it today, you would still get it. I can see no reason why, because the other few flows that still flow in town, namely the big Walter Kelly flow, is still gushing water. Rogers City had a tremendous underlay of water reservoirs underneath the limestone, because the whole community is underlaid with limestone, I suppose, in their big caverns. Now, just what power or what force or gas forces that water up after it's tapped and it comes to the surface, I don't know. I'm not a hydrologist, know enough about geology to answer that question. But we do know that after the water came in, then, of course, the city sewers came in 1948. Before that, everybody had cesspools or septic tanks or outside toilets. Now, the city sewer lines run down the alley. And when that came in, the folks bypassed the cesspool and the septic tank, and then the sewage went right out to the sanitary sewer line. With the coming of the sanitary sewer line, of course, was the last vestiges of the outdoor toilets had to go, finally by order of the health department. There were a lot of people that had cesspools and septic tanks and had water tanks, but they operated by electric power. Now, as far as the upstairs of the house is concerned, in our home, at the time they built the house, they did provide for one upstairs bedroom right at the top of the stairs, as you recall. For a period of time, the rest of that was just like a big basketball court up there. It had a flooring in it, and there were times when Herman and I and others would sleep up there, but you just slept right on the floor. Then, after coming electricity, when the parents decided that they wanted to make bedrooms up there, then, of course, they divided and made the two great big additional bedrooms and the various closets that went off of that to the various rooms. At the same time, they improved and enlarged that back bedroom that Ernestine, Treese, and Grace used. Instead of having just one window that faced the back, or two, they had four. They enlarged the closets, finished them off. Now that's the room, of course, where the chimney runs right through the center of the room, which is a nice back warmer to warm your back on cold winter days. And of course, closets were also added. Now, as far as the outside of the house is concerned, the front yard, when I was a kid, what I first remember of it was that vegetables were planted right through the street. I recall potatoes being planted and beans and corn. Now that didn't last too long, but there still were about 3 apple trees right out in the front yard. And but this big spruce that you see there today, 30 foot tall or better, were not planted until about 1925-26. They're beautiful looking trees today. And of course the entire yard was fenced back in the early days. Now, along with that on the street side, I remember before we had street lights, we had the lamplighter that lit the lamps along the street. I'll think more about that afterwards. I went by the old house today, and it looks very, very good. Very neat, shrubbery, nicely trimmed. This is the third owner since Grace and Jean left, or Mother and Grace and Jean left. And the couple that has it now are probably 28, 29, 30 years old. They have 3 small children. I have met her. Very, very friendly. He is an employee of the State Department of Welfare, works in Alpena, drives back and forth, and is waiting to get into here to the Rogers City office. They keep the outside very, very neat. I walked around some of the yard with her when I was over there the other day. I didn't get to go into the house, but I tried to explain to her the location of the well, and then we went in to take a look at the barn or the garage, and she had a hard time visualizing that that was a horse barn. She said, actually? I said, yes. Well, she said, did you see the horses? Yes. I said, I was here. Well, she said they wondered about that upstairs there. They wondered about the big door on the side of the alley. Well, I said, that's where they put in the hay. And I said, there were cribs here and there were oat bins, and horses were actually kept here. Now, I said, not full time. I said, that's just when my parents rented a horse. They wanted a horse for the following day to go someplace. And so that's the way it went. I know I talked to Dorothy Bertram the other day, and she said too that these people are doing a beautiful job in that yard. She said she has never met these people, but she plans to go over anytime soon. Now, it just so happens that of those four corners, on that four corners there, a third of Woodward, Dorothy is the only one of the original family that is still living in the same place. But all the homes are well kept, which I think is very, very nice. Well, that's enough for today. Hi there. Well, we want to start off with a little different tangent now. I want to start out on an article which I call just dates and places and sights and sounds and smells and flavors that I recall of Roger City and my youth. Now, when I refer to dates in here, you got to remember that a lot of these dates I had to fill in afterwards. I don't remember specifically at the time that it happened that it was 1916 or 17 or 18, but I could fill that in in later years. Now, one of the first dates I got here is that you understand that I recall the event or the place. I don't remember whether it was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or whether it was morning or afternoon. But in 1916, to start with, I remember boarding a boat, Dean Sea boat here in Roger City, a side-wheeler, two-sided wheeler. I think that's what fascinated me. And my dad took me to Toledo and Cleveland to see a doctor about my foot, my polio problem. They spent an awful lot of money taking me to see doctors that they'd heard of that could do something about it. In this case, it didn't amount to much, according to what Mother told me afterwards. Now, why go by boat instead of by train? Well, it was a little cheaper, and if you went by boat, say from here to Toledo, ordinarily you would have maybe one or two stops along the way. Maybe it would be at Alpena, or maybe it would be at Port Huron, maybe it would be at Harbor Beach. But ordinarily, you didn't have to, like you went by train, you changed trains in Bay City. You got to Detroit, you changed trains again to go to Toledo. If you went to Cleveland, you trained another train. But by going by boat, no transfers were necessary. And it was a little bit cheaper. Now, one of the first days I recall was going to kindergarten, which I found out later was 1917. And the teacher was Mrs. Lillian Dedman. Now, there happened to be two classmates of that day still here in Roger City. One is Beth Monroe, that many of you remember, and the other one was Catherine Crowell Pollock, who was our neighbor. Now, I often see them, and I talk to them every once in a while during the period that I was making these tapes, just to satisfy certain dates. Now, some of the other smells and sounds. I remember November 11th, 1918. Now, I didn't know what it was called Armistice Day, but that's what we call it today. But that was the day that World War I ended officially. Now, I knew something about war because we talked about it in kindergarten. They talked about it in the first grade. I wasn't certain as to what it was, but nevertheless, the war ended. And I remember going with Herman and Mother and Dad, this was in November, down to the courthouse square, where there was to be a big celebration, and there was. Now, the old gazebo that we had here in town was already there. And a band was playing out of the old gazebo, and some of the people in their heavier clothes were dancing in the street. A good time was being had by all. That gazebo, by the way, which is still here in the old Westminster Park, goes back probably to about 1900. Nobody seems to really know how it got there, who ordered it, who paid for it, or whether it belonged to the city or belonged to the county. But the gazebo is still there. It's been repaired and refurbished many times. I suppose most of the original boards have been replaced, but the basic design is still there. It was a design that you found all over Americana at that time. Many, many little towns had almost an identical gazebo for some civic function. Maybe it was a band or some other city park. In 1919, I remember going to St. Louis, Missouri for polio treatment by train. Dad and Grandpa Dramberg were with me. Grandpa was to stay with me. Went to Detroit by train, pulled into the Michigan Central Depot there, transferred to a train going to St. Louis, Missouri. Now, later on, I heard it at the time, it didn't mean too much to me, but the name of that train was the Wabash Cannonball. And I went down through Ohio, across Indiana, across Illinois, and when we got to East St. Louis, Missouri, there was the mighty Mississippi. What a wonderful sight. My first view. We crossed on Eads Bridge, still there, and entered St. Louis in their great Central Historic Union Station, which is a national landmark. I was down there, as you recall, for a stay of about 9 months and came back home in June of 1920. That was 1920. And then about 18 months later, Grandpa and I took another trip down there for about 90 days. Now, in the fall of 1925, Dad took me to Minneapolis to enter the Shriners Hospital for Crippled Children, which had just recently been built there. The Shriners specialize in that operation even today. They have, I think, 15 or 16 or 17 hospitals throughout the United States where they care for crippled children and children that have been burned. The biggest thing I remember about that was that I had about 4 operations there on my leg. But the big thing was that when I was through the following spring, I was walking on shoes and without crutches. I had been on crutches for many, many years. That was a great thrill for me. Then in the fall of 1930, after going through high school, I entered Michigan State, got my bachelor's degree and a life certificate in 1934. My master's degree I got in 1939 from the University of Michigan. Now, the first day of teaching in the school system of Rogers City was September 8th, 1935. I still have the book. Who did I meet? The first class that I attended and went into as a teacher was in history, U.S. history, grade 8. And there was Ernestine Treese with a couple of other cohorts that I remember, cohorts. One was Dagner, Fred Dagner. Another was Bill Newhouse. Among the many other girls, I remember 2 that come right to mind. One was Mildred Fleming, another one was Eunice Lamb. But it was a full class. Later on that day, in world history, who did I run into? My sister Grace. 10th grade. Some of her classmates there, one was Virginia King, Gerald Button, Dr. Bruce Kane, Dennis Nalpina, Elmer Ratke, attorney, former prosecutor here in Presque Isle County, and a host of others. In the study hall, I met Joe. Besides that, I had charge of study halls and was in charge of that infamous institution, the 9th hour. Now, the next date that I've listed here that made a big impression, of course, on most of us was December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. And in Rogers City, that was a Sunday. Now, on August 1st of 42, I married Marion in Leadington. And on June 6th of 44 was D-Day, the invasion of Europe. Where was I? Well, I found out that it was actually D-Day. I was walking across Grand Circus Park in Detroit, going for a medical appointment. Also, June 15th of 44, I was appointed high school principal to succeed John D. Sibley. Then in August of 45, 6th and August 9th were 2 events that were changed the history of the world. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then, and other dates that that come to mind, was that in 1955, 50, I was appointed superintendent of schools to succeed H. Gilpin, who suddenly died, December of 50. Now, in 1955, we built the new elementary building. And in 1958, November 18th, Carl D. Bradley went down with a tremendous loss of 33 lives, many of them out of Rogers City. About 10 of those fellows I had had in my classes previously. In 1964, we built the new high school. And in 1950, June, I retired. June 30th, 1973, rather, I retired, along with Marion, after 38 years in the system. Now, Marion and I had a marriage that lasted 50 years. She passed away January 27th, 1993, buried in Rogers City Cemetery in the George and Alma Grambua lot. Now, just a few months ago, May 27th, 1994, I attended the 60th class reunion of my class from Michigan State at East Lansing and Kellogg Center. George and Martha came up and got me, and they attended that affair with me. Fortunately, during that period of time, I was able to locate two former classmates of mine from the class of 34, a Ralph Recor and a Bob Kelly. They were fraternity brothers of mine. We lived together in the fraternity house over on Bogue Street in East Lansing at that time. Ralph and I had met the day before, just a few periods before that, a few months before that. We had accidentally met in East Lansing. The day after that meeting in East Lansing, at Kellogg, we went to Detroit. And there we met another fraternity brother that Ralph had found out, or located for me. A fellow by the name of Bob Kelly, who lived in Marysville. The next day we went up to St. Clair to see John and Amelia Moffat, Marion's sister-in-law and nephew. And there we met again with Recor and had lunch. But it was a wonderful time to locate people that you hadn't seen in 60 years, that you had lived with for a period of 3 years. And we were busy recalling, trying to find out who in that group of maybe 75 or 80 people that we knew quite well were still around. We're still exchanging information. All right, now, what are the other things that we ran into along the way? In Rogers City, there was the old school bell, which was on top of the second floor tower in the old yellow building. That bell rang for years and years, starting about 1903, as I get it, a half hour before school in the morning, and then on the hour at 9 o'clock. It rang again at noon for the afternoon session. Now that bell is now displayed in the courtyard of the new high school as a kind of a canopy over it. I helped ring that bell the last time. It was in June of 1956, just before we shut the old building down and moved up to the new one. Now there are other bells in the community. The Lutheran Church had a bell, the Catholic Church had a bell. Now, the Lutheran Church, the Catholic Church, bells, they had a bell that sounded at the death of one of its members. You recall, during the course of the day, if a member died, and they were 20 years old, the bell, you'd either, depending upon where you were, would toll 20 times. If you were 50, it tolled 50 times. They don't do that any longer at the St. John's Church, but I understand they still do it at St. Ignatius. It was a very unusual custom. Now, another sound of Rogers City in the early days, which you used to hear about a lot about, and that was the foghorns. Now, the foghorns are still down there. There's a foghorn at the fish dock down here yet. There's a foghorn at Michigan Line. There's a foghorn at 40 Mile Point. But the total amount of traffic on the lake is much different than it was, say, 50, 60 years ago. Then you not only had the fish tugs coming in out of the harbor, a good number, you had the D&C boats, and you had the limestone boats. And you had boats that were carrying lumber. Now, and down on the lake also, you had the sound of the tugs at Calcite, helping ships coming into the harbor, turning them around, backing them up so that they'd move into the slips for loading. At night, or even in the day, those tugs sounded certain shorts and longs. So many shorts, so many longs meant something. And so many, and they had whistles instead of the, we're talking about sounds, whistles. Today we no longer have the tugs. And later on, of course, you got telephones that replaced the sound of the tugs. The tugs still operated, but they talked together by phone. But these tugs were a necessary part of the life in the early days. The tugs and the big boats talked together like we would call a Morse code, by short blats at the whistle. Now, another sound that was very, very familiar and still is today in Rogers City, and that is the sound of the city band during the course of the summer. Once a week for a period of 10, 12, or 13 or 14 weeks, the band would play at the old courthouse years ago. Now they play in Westminster Park, or they play at the beachfront. But every Friday night there used to be a band concert. And you could almost always bet that one of the songs that they played was Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever. The band is still going, even today. I don't know how many communities still have bands, but Rogers City still has its bands. The high schools today, of course, are the feeder systems for the city band. Now, what are some of the other sights and sounds that came out of my memory? One, I recall the distinct odor of what is called horse manure when you walked by the livery stable going up to the rink. You walked by the livery stable, that's what it was. I recall the sound of the old fire bell, which is associated with the city hall, just where the city hall is now. There was a large bell, probably about 2.5 to 3 feet diameter in the bottom. We're talking about the city fire bell. Pardon the interruption on the phone. The fire bell was mounted on a 7 or 8 foot platform, had a big clamor on it, and it made a good amount of noise when they worked that clamor. Later on, it was a siren was substituted for that. And another one of the familiar sounds of Rogers City in the early days, and that was the sound of the D&M Railroad coming down through town, all the way down through town on 2nd Street, sounding its whistle across, I think, 11 or 12 blocks, 11 or 12 streets. Blatted every street in, every street out. Now, it's interesting to note, for all the years that train came in, now the tracks have been taken up, well, I don't ever recall a serious accident of any kind occurring by that train hitting cars. I recall cars running into the train. The train was standing still. But it's quite remarkable. For all those years and all those stops, all those crossings, they were very, very cautious and moved very, very slow. As I mentioned before, we had a city lamplighter before we had the electric lights coming along Main Street. The lamplighter, there was a lamp in our corner. This was a good-sized lamp, probably 18 to 20 inches high, four-sided, all glass, mounted on probably a 6 or 6.5 foot pole. And the lamplighter came along. He had a little wagon, a couple of cans of kerosene, a little ladder, and he'd get up there on that ladder, open a door. One of the door had a catch on it that could be opened up. He'd check the wick, and then he'd pour in just a certain amount of oil into that container. Lit the lamp, closed it off, and that lamp would burn overnight. Now, it burned a little longer in the wintertime. It probably was lit by 5, and it lasted until 5 the next morning, maybe about 12 hours. But in the summertime, the lamp was lit probably until 8 o'clock in the evening. It depended upon the amount of daylight hours. Now, those lamps were used until the street lights came in. After, I think it was probably 1914 or 15 that they started to see what happened there was that the plant put in a power plant to run its operation. Then after they got going, they sold excess power to the Rogers City Power Company. And the Rogers City Power Company then put up poles up and down the street. And it's from off of those poles, of course, now they're in the alleys, that people wired their homes. And that was the same thing with the street lights. Now the fire marshal, the only one that I remember in my day, was Marshal Smith, Marshal Bill Smith. Smith was Schultz, Marshal Schultz. He only lived a few doors away. He was not only the village marshal, he was the village fire marshal. He was the man that repaired the streets and also took care of the streets, that is, dragged the streets, made sure that they were level. And he also built the ice rink, the beautiful ice rink in the ballpark for the wintertime. He was a mason by trade. Now, another characteristic of Rogers that I recall vividly, or remember vividly hearing, was the blasting at the quarry, the nearby quarry. That limestone, of course, from the face of the quarry had to be loosened so that they could be picked up by shovels and put into railroad cars, taken to the mills to be ground up, sized. And when those blasts went off, those walls were sometimes 50, 60, maybe 70 foot deep, or whatever the height might be. Charges of dynamite were put in the holes, in several holes, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 holes, and then they were shut off. They were sounded off, and of course, all that face of that rock would cave down. Well, that concussion shook the whole town because, as I say, the whole town is underlaid with limestone. And so most of the homes in Rogers City had their plastered walls cracked. I know we did at home. I know the plastered walls in the school were cracked. Now, that's not the foundation. That's the softer plaster walls that did all the cracking. But that's life in a quarry town. When I was in grade school, up till age 16, I was to answer the curfew. The curfew said to you, get off the street by 9:30. The siren rang. In the early days, it was the fire bell that rang. And it was generally obeyed quite well. Now, in later years, it was relaxed somewhat, especially for high school students, because when we got into the newer buildings, then there were dances after basketball games, dances after football games. But as a youngster, the curfew was there. It wasn't a bad idea. I don't know whether you can make it work today or not. Now, also, following right along with that, as I mentioned before, that I recall the resounds of the sleigh bells on the horses, on the sleighs in the wintertime. And I remember one time that in the wintertime, Christmas time, that Dad apparently hired a rig, a sleigh, and Mother and Dad, her and I, went out to Grambua and Dramber's, and the harness had sleigh bells on it. It was a beautiful memory of that particular era. And that, of course, that was, most of the things in the time just a matter of custom. The farmer would put on you could attach it to any piece of the harness. And but that was quite common in the early days of the wintertime to, especially in the Christmas season, to have the sleigh bells. Now, in the early days of